Thank you, Charles, Denis, both for sparing time in a hell of a busy week, another one. Very good of you to join us. I think I'm going to start by asking you, Charles, what you think the state of play is in the talks. You're back from Brussels quite recently.
Talks is the right word, not negotiations. The two sides are still far apart. Unless they both move substantially, there will not be any kind of deal on a new withdrawal agreement. But having talked to people on both sides, I can see where there just might be a landing ground that both could end up occupying. We're not there yet. I think the landing ground would be a modified version of the original Northern Ireland-only backstop that the EU proposed to the British in early 2018, whereby Northern Ireland would be in the EU's customs union and those parts of the single market necessary to ensure there's no border controls on goods passing between the north and south of Ireland. Now that wasn't any good for the British before, which is why it was abandoned. So it would have to be modified somewhat to make it a bit more palatable to the British. That is where I think the landing ground is, if there is one.
Denis, you come with various perspectives, having worked in Brussels, now in London, in touch with Dublin. From those perspectives, what's your sense of the state of play of these talks?
I think Charles is right. That is the landing zone if you can get there. And so what we're talking about is this Northern Ireland only solution. It would probably be called a replacement to the backstop. But what it would mean would be that, for example, Boris Johnson could get his wish in taking most of the UK into a much looser arrangement with the European Union, more like Canada. Rather than the closer one that Theresa May had anticipated, and then that Northern Ireland would remain more aligned with the European Union. There are three elements to it, though, and one of them looks like it's going quite well, which is about regulation. So how does Northern Ireland remain aligned in terms of regulation with the EU and the rest of Ireland, and you create some kind of divergence with the UK. Now, the DUP and the British government have already said they're fine with doing that for animal health checks, agri-food. There are some other areas, and Arlene Foster, the leader of the DUP, this week in Dublin was suggesting that, hinting that she was open to extending this to those other areas that Charles mentioned, which affect the all-island economy. The second bit is customs, and that is more problematic because as far as the Unionists are concerned in Northern Ireland, this is where they've decided that sovereignty is located. And so the idea that they should be part of the customs territory of the European Union rather than just of the United Kingdom is a problem. And then the third bit is what they would call consent. So in other words, how do you have some mechanism whereby the political institutions in Northern Ireland can make a decision about any new regulations that they're obliged to follow after this mechanism comes into play?
Well, let's just drill down to consent and customs. Consent first, maybe. I mean, Stormont isn't always there, as we know. How do you make sure that there is consent from say, the DUP's perspective, but also how do you make sure, Charles, that consent doesn't look like a veto and they'll be hopping in and out of various rules whenever they fancy?
On the consent point, I think the EU has no problem at all with a consultation mechanism so that the institutions of Northern Ireland are consulted on any changes to the rules applying to Northern Ireland. Nobody in the EU is against consultation, but if that becomes a veto, then there's a problem because you can't have a single market working if individual geographical zones can change the rules applying to them.
So they have a right to be heard?
Yes.
But not more?
Not a right to veto. The EU will not agree to that. And I think the British hope that they can get some sort of right to veto if they pay a price, but I think the EU would not want any prices paid, that the EU would just say no to a veto.
So does that sound plausible from your context, Denis?
Yeah, I think that Charles is absolutely right. The European Union will not accept a veto. There have been other things that you could look at. Like, for example, if you think about the European Economic Area, Norway and Iceland, they don't automatically accept new regulations that are imposed by the European Union. But in fact, if they choose not to, the price is so enormous in terms of cutting off market access that it's effectively automatic. But you do have these mechanisms whereby they can be consulted. And within the withdrawal agreement, there are mechanisms for consulting with the United Kingdom government. I think this will be a key point, that as far as the Europeans are concerned, they're not going to deal directly with Stormont. They will deal with the United Kingdom government. And it's a matter for the United Kingdom as to whether it allows Stormont to have a say. I think there's another issue where consent is concerned, and this is where there's a dispute between Dublin and London. In the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement, the idea of consent is, according to the UK Supreme Court, it is confined to a very narrow issue, and that is whether Northern Ireland consents to be part of the United Kingdom or part of a united Ireland. And so the idea that you have to have cross-community consent, so in other words, you have to have a majority from both communities to consent to anything to do with Brexit, it falls down, first of all, because, of course, you didn't have cross-community consent for Brexit itself. Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, and a majority of the nationalist population also did. So I think, first of all, there's going to be that issue. And then I think what you will get into is questions like, for example, if you were to have Stormont back, and if Stormont were to have a say, would you, for example, say that if a new regulation or a change to regulations was coming, the default would be that Northern Ireland would accept it? And so to block it, you would have to have a majority in both communities. So you'd have to have this parallel majority. So you're then setting the bar quite high. Now, there may be some issue in the future where both Sinn Féin and the DUP feel as if their interests are being affected. And then you have to work out, as Charles says, what do you do about that? The European Union will not accept a veto on its legislation, but is there some way that, that this kind of consultation can be beefed up, I think is the question.
Customs, then, Charles. Can you be in the customs union but not?
No, you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're either in the customs union or you're not. This is going to be, I think, perhaps the most difficult area, because when I talk to somebody in one of the member states recently, one of the more important member states, influential member states, who was sketching out what the deal could look like, he said, look, in quite a few areas, farm and plant and animal health, but also other areas, the UK will have to make sure Northern Ireland is aligned with the EU and the south of Ireland. In some areas, we could live with the Northern Ireland not being aligned, but then there have to be checks, discrete checks. So you put it dematerialise, delocalise, de-dramatise, meaning discrete and a long way away from any border to not provoke terrorists to blow them up. But I think if you get into the drill down to the specifics of which areas the EU would insist on alignment and which areas it could live without alignment, I think customs, the EU will insist on alignment because it's so important to other things. The EU says rightly that you can't disentangle so-called SPS checks, the plant and animal health checks, from customs checks, because you need to check for tariffs, you need to check for compliance with rules of origin and all sorts of things. So I think that the EU will stick to its line, customs, the Northern Irish must be part of the EU's customs union. In other areas they could live with more divergence. But the trouble is, as Denis has said, that the DUP has given customs as one area where they would not agree to align with the EU.
Denis, do you see any way through that for the DUP?
I think there may be a way through it more generally. I think that you can be, where customs is concerned, a little bit, not so much a little bit pregnant, but both pregnant and non-pregnant at the same time, insofar as the European Union doesn't say that Northern Ireland has to be part of the customs union. It said it would be treated as part of the European Union customs territory, and it must follow the European Union Customs Code, which sounds like being
What's the difference?
The customs union. Well, it's a theological or a Jesuitical difference. But what they would say, the Europeans would say, is that actually there are areas, say, for example, the Canary Islands, which might not be part of the customs union, but they're actually part of the customs territory. Yeah. So it is a Jesuitical distinction.
But it might just get the DUP off the hook.
Well, I think maybe some variation.
Or maybe if you don't call it Jesuitical.
Exactly, but exactly. But if you get it, or at least it might offer a pointer as to the kind of creative way you might be able to do this. But I think where you're absolutely right, Charles, is there is a problem with disentangling the checks. And so what the Europeans will say is these customs checks and, say, animal health checks, they're separate, but they're not separable. That actually you kind of have to do them all in the same place. So I think that a lot of this stuff will depend to a great extent on how the DUP's thinking evolves. And if you look at what Arlene Foster has been saying in the last few days, one of the really striking things that she's been doing is that she's disinterred a letter that she and Martin McGuinness wrote in August of 2016.
It's taken on holy value suddenly.
Absolutely, and this thing had really been, entombed in a vault for the last few years. But this was, when the government was still going there, he was Deputy First Minister, she was First Minister, and they wrote a letter outlining what they, on behalf of Northern Ireland, thought was necessary. And what they were talking about was a lot of special arrangements for the island of Ireland, and they took into account the all-island economy, all kinds of things that have been no-nos in the last few weeks from the government here. So I think that, the logic of that thinking would be that while sovereignty must be respected, and maybe that there must be some way where this so-called consent mechanism is concerned, that there must be some way that Northern Ireland can pull some kind of an emergency cable. That nonetheless, that actually in practical terms, for all those kinds of checks, maybe you can actually do them all at the port of Belfast, where there's lots of room, or at Larne, or at, that, in other words, that you don't have to have checks anywhere on the island of Ireland.
Well, can I just ask you, Denis, something about the politics of all of this? All that stuff you've just been describing, both of you, was knocking around months and months ago. What kind of journey have the DUP been on, where you and I can remember conversations with members of it, where they were slightly sniffing around that stuff and sounding positive, and then went on a very banner-waving hostile journey somewhere else to the idea, and now seem to be back there?
I think they find themselves in a curious position, in that their votes, although Boris Johnson has lost a majority and his minus majority is much greater than their 10 votes, that their 10 votes still are very important insofar as if the DUP signs up to something on the backstop, it's very hard for Eurosceptic Conservatives to say we're more unionist than they are. So in that sense, they're crucial. But on the other hand, there is a moment of truth coming in terms of the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, followed by an election in Northern Ireland where they do stand already to lose a couple of their seats. And they don't, I think, want to be responsible for a no-deal Brexit. And Arlene Foster, again, has been very clear about saying this over the last few days. We are not a no-deal party. And to be fair to Nigel Dodds and others, they've always said that too. That's not been their preference to have a no-deal Brexit. So I think
it's not always been the tone, though, has it? One might think, for people who were listening to them, some of the voices, particularly maybe the ones who were keenest to go to the microphone, sounded pretty strident.
That's true, but then you also remember it was in the context of Theresa May's leadership of the Conservative Party, where they would have felt, along with a lot of Brexiteers, there was another option which was going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Now, I think for Brexiteers and also for the DUP, Boris Johnson is the last stop on this particular bus route. And so if they don't get off where he's getting off, and if they don't go with whatever deal he's going with, then I think they could risk all kinds of things.
They panicked at the cliff edge a bit.
I think there's probably some, I think there certainly would be some anxiety where they're concerned, I think without a doubt. There's, I think also, though, that, their commitment to Brexit is something which is, it's not necessarily entirely pure. It's pretty clear that most of them didn't believe that Brexit was going to win the referendum. And they thought that this was a position they could take.
Do a bit of virtue signalling.
Yeah, and they had been traditionally a Eurosceptic party. I mean, initially the late Reverend Ian Paisley thought it was a popish plot, the European Union, and he railed against it in that way. So their tradition is Eurosceptic. But in practical terms, I don't think really most of them expected it to happen. And I think when it did happen, they didn't quite know where to put themselves.
And Charles, in terms of sticking with the politics for a second, when you're going around the European capitals, do you get a sense that they think Boris Johnson could get a deal of the kind you've been talking about through Parliament? And one other question as well, which is, do they think Boris Johnson's basically been boxed into looking for a deal suddenly with more focus because he couldn't get the election he wanted? How do they read him on that front?
Yeah, well, I think they think he is boxed in. I think they weren't sure for quite a long time whether he wanted a deal or not. His fairly, to them, extreme behaviour of sacking the 21 rebels, proroguing Parliament, all that kind of stuff, that made them think, saying that he might not follow the Ben law of extending the Article 50, all these things made them think he's taking such an extreme line, he probably doesn't want a deal at all. But recently they've understood that he probably needs a deal, Because if he doesn't get a deal by the 31st of October, he's going to have to go to the EU and ask for an extension of Article 50, which is what he promised he'd never do. So he's in a pickle, and he's tried to hold an election, Parliament wouldn't let him, so he's in a double pickle. He can't even hold an election to break the deadlock right now. So if he gets a deal, then the Benn bill extending Article 50 becomes null and void. So he has a strong incentive to get a deal. They see that. They think he's serious, and some of the comments he's made in private to EU leaders make them think he's at least half serious about getting a deal. So I think that therefore they think he's got to move further than he's moved so far. He's got to present some serious written proposals on what he wants, which he hasn't yet done. And when he does present those written proposals, maybe the EU will have to respond, and probably will have to respond. It's waiting, it's desperate for written proposals. The risk is, of course, they leak and embarrass Boris Johnson, but that's tough. That's the way politics works. On your point about the Parliament, yes, they
often know our numbers better than we do, don't they?
They do. I mean, they've 3 times Theresa May told the EU she could get the deal through Parliament, and she promised them she could. And 3 times she was voted down by a mixture of Tory rebels and opposition parties. So they're very wary of doing all the hard work of getting compromises, only to see another deal voted down in Parliament. Having said that, they don't want no deal, so they will probably, suck it and see and just hope for the best. If Boris says he can get a deal through Parliament. My own view is a deal could get through Parliament, perhaps. I mean, nobody can be sure, but the opposition parties would mostly vote against a deal. Some Labour MPs would vote for a deal, however, because the Stephen Kinnock faction of Labour MPs are very keen for Brexit to happen because they represent Eurosceptic constituencies where voters want to see Brexit being implemented, but with a deal. So there's a certain number of Labour MPs will support it. Who knows how many, maybe 20, but I can't be sure of that figure. Against that, furthermore, even if you look at the Tory rebels, the 21 Tories who lost the whip, some of them want Brexit to happen. They just want a deal. So they will vote for it, the sort of David Liddington, Amber Rudd Tories. Others like Dominic Grieve, who are trying to stop Brexit, or Sam Gyimah, who's now joined another party, will vote against it. And as for the DUP, as we've said, it looks like they might support a deal in certain circumstances, depending on what the details are. They're not, and if they support a deal, then a lot of the ERG, the right-wing Tory faction, will support a deal too. Some of the ERG will vote against the deal whatever happens because they want to have very, very, very hard Brexit. But I think quite a lot of them would respond to Boris's pleas and imprecations if there is a deal on the table. So I could conceive of the deal passing very narrowly, but it's very hard to say. Nobody can be sure.
Do you get the impression they think Boris Johnson is across the detail?
EU leaders, no. They know Boris Johnson well enough to know he's not a detail man. But they also know him well enough to know that he's somebody he's somebody who probably knows what he wants, and they think they know what he wants now. He wants a deal, and as long as other people can do the detail, he can sell it. He's a salesman, and they think they understand he's a better salesman than Theresa May, and if he does get a deal, he'll stand a better chance of selling it to the British people and to the British Parliament than Theresa May did.
Dennis, how is the Dublin government feeling right now about the direction of travel, the risks, the upside?
I think they're probably encouraged by what the DUP are saying. I think they're a little bit anxious that Boris Johnson's optimism may be a problem for him and for everybody else, in that I think that they fear that the evidence of the last week or so, and indeed the lunch in Luxembourg with Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier, was that maybe Boris Johnson didn't understand the distance that he will actually have to travel if he's to reach a point where a deal is possible. I think he's also doing 2 things that Theresa May also did, oddly enough. One is to talk up the chances of a deal, perhaps unwisely, and the second is to denigrate over and over again the very things he's likely to have to accept in a few weeks' time. And so, so Stephen Barclay, the Brexit secretary, has been out in Madrid, promoting a very hard line on all of these issues. And so
this is really going to hurt you guys, he was saying in a speech today.
Yeah, it's going to hurt, the Irish, and it's going to hurt the Spanish more than it hurts us, and telling the Irish.
Even listed which cheeses we would might not take so easily.
And he was also talking then about sort of how many, all the medicines that wouldn't be able to get into Ireland. That kind of thing doesn't go down terribly well, in any case. But it also, I think, it underestimates the extent to which the rest of the European Union, including Ireland, have actually accepted and internalized the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. They don't regard it as an end state. They think that if Britain leaves without a deal, that something else has to happen afterwards, that there has to be some negotiation about a deal. And they also know that, although it will be difficult, particularly for Ireland, that actually it's likely to be a much bigger problem for the UK because Ireland will still have its place in the European Union, whereas the UK will have no trading relationship with us.
If I was the Irish government, I'd be a little bit worried because people in France and Germany are saying if there's a deal on the table that requires some compromise on all sides, we will gently ask the Irish if they could live with something a bit less perfect than the current backstop. A bit less perfect, meaning possibly a few controls in a few places on a few things. At the moment, the Irish have what they want. They have a backstop that means no controls on the border between the north and south at all in any respects, which is what, understandably, they quite rightly want. But a final compromise will probably mean less than perfect alignment between Northern Ireland and the EU in some areas, and therefore some controls, even if they are, as the EU officials say, dematerialised, delocalised and de-dramatised. And then, that is might be slightly awkward for the Irish and politically difficult for Varadkar. He'd have to accept something then, or be asked to accept something a little bit less perfect than he would wish.
His opponents would be circling Leo Varadkar then, wouldn't they?
They would be. I think, though, that it's important to remember what the backstop is about for the Irish. It's obviously about keeping the border open, but it's also about the integrity of the European single market and the security of Ireland's place in it. The reason that the Irish, for example, resist the idea that you'd have exemptions or turn a blind eye to smuggling over the border is because the Irish wanted to be very clear in terms of their exports, particularly to countries outside the European Union, that the single market standards in Ireland are just as rock solid as they are in Denmark or
Pure as the driven snow.
Absolutely. And this matters because if you're, say, an Irish foodstuffs company selling baby powder to China, that's something that's really going to count. And so this is an area where, and it's been clear also in Leo Varadkar's recent statements, that actually when it comes to a choice between having to have some infrastructure near the border or having to have some kind of controls and protecting Ireland's place in the single market, he's always going to protect Ireland's place in the single market because that seems to be, to him, to be an existential and central Irish national interest.
When I'm hearing you describe the sort of things that need to be in place for Ireland, for the EU, Denis, I'm thinking that title that they're going to give this schedule in any sort of paper for the talks, you said it might be called replacement for the backstop. Was there ever anything more mistitled than that? I mean, it does sound an awful lot like a backstop by another name.
Yeah, and I'm sure that it'll have some other name, but I mean, essentially, as far as the Irish at least are concerned, it has to fulfil those functions. The Europeans, as far as they're concerned, it's the central importance is that there should be no backdoor into the single market, that also whatever arrangement you make shouldn't be one that allows an army of Trojan horses to come galloping across the seas to Ireland and through into the single market. And so, so I think there are points beyond which they won't go. And I think, funnily enough, the kind of pressure that Charles was talking about, there was more talk about that a while back when there was talk for a while about would the Irish accept a time limit on the backstop, if it was 7 years or 10 years, whatever it is, what's your problem? That's all gone. Nobody's talking about that anymore, partly because, of course, Boris Johnson said he doesn't want a time limit, he's not interested in anything like that. And so I think, and oddly enough, there has been some private pressure coming from Brussels to the Irish, warning them not to backslide on the elements of the backstop that are important to the Europeans, those single market elements I'm talking about. So I mean, so certainly there's no question that if we get to a point where we're very close to what appears to be a reasonable deal, and the Irish appear to be unreasonable about demanding every last jot and tittle, then I'm sure that the Europeans will say, listen, it's time to take something that's okay. But I'm sure that the Irish actually, in terms of Varadkar's political position, I don't think he would pay a political price for accepting a deal that appears to fulfill more or less what the requirements are.
It's a backstop.
It's basically a backstop, and you can call it whatever you want.
They're willing to call it anything, aren't they, Charles, to get it done?
Yes.
They'll call it the Dominic Cummings
They call it the special economic zone or something.
Yeah. And that'll have some appeal to the DUP if they called it something like that, because it sounds like your best of both worlds.
Exactly. They can call it anything at all.
Can we delve back into the politics and the sort of longer term stuff? When people look at an outline deal along the lines, Denis, of what you're describing could be there if they shake on it, where do you think that takes the politics of Ireland as an island, and the possibility of a future border poll, the possibility of people beginning to change their thinking about whether they belong in one jurisdiction or another? People must be pondering this.
They are pondering it, and Brexit obviously has taken an issue that about Irish unity, which nobody had to think about for the last 20 years. They are starting to think about it now. The fear that unionists have about the backstop is not so much what happens today, but this idea of dynamic alignment, so that in 10 years' time, that all of these regulations will have come from Brussels, that really, if you want to in some way influence them, you've got to go to Dublin to try to do it, and so that the economies will become more and more integrated. On the other hand, if you were to have anything like a border, or if you were to have a no-deal Brexit, that would actually make a united Ireland much more likely, because one of the reasons why you've always had a majority in favour of remaining in the United Kingdom is because you've had the acquiescence of a large part of the Catholic or the nationalist population. Because what they felt, and particularly in the last 20 years, is we're used to living in this polity, we like the National Health Service. The fact is that because of the Good Friday Agreement, they could choose to be Irish or British or both. Because the border was open, they could they could go to school across the border, they could do all of these things. And so it just wasn't necessary to change which state you were in. Now, if you were to have a border, and if you were to have a no-deal Brexit, that could change. As against all of that, there's a new study out this week about the costs of Irish unity and the cost to both parties. And one of the things that it found was that if you were to keep the level of subsidy, which is about 9 billion a year going to Northern Ireland, if you were to keep that, which you probably would have to keep for the sake of social peace, then that would mean Irish people in the south reducing their living standards by 10%. So that they could maintain living standards in Northern Ireland, which is an economy that doesn't really work very well. Most people work for the state. Educational attainment is very bad. So I think we're quite a long way away from a united Ireland if you have some kind of deal with the backstop kind of arrangement we're talking about.
But a new conversation starts.
A new conversation is starting, partly because a new conversation is starting in Northern Ireland, because you've seen a huge increase in the number of people who describe themselves as neither unionist nor nationalist, and who embrace a Northern Irish identity. You've seen the rise of the Alliance Party, and so I think you find younger people are breaking out of the way they think.
We haven't mentioned Scotland at all. And what we're saying amongst ourselves is very relevant for people who care about Scottish independence or not. Because if we end up, as we've been suggesting, with some sort of special status for Northern Ireland, more or less in a customs union, more or less in parts of the single market, then Mrs. Nicola Sturgeon is going to say, I want that too. And the British will say, well, don't be silly. You can't have that. You don't have a border with the EU like Northern Ireland does. You have a border with England, so it doesn't make sense for you to be outside the UK's market, inside the EU single market. But nevertheless, if the British say to the Scottish, you can't have what Northern Ireland's having, they can stay close to the EU and you can't, that'll be a fantastic gift to Mrs. Sturgeon to make Scots think, gosh, we need independence because the British are treating us very, very badly, which is one of the reasons why the deal may struggle to get through Parliament.
And one of the reasons that it founded all those months ago, and
yes.
Something a lot like this was...
Yes, if you're a British MP from whatever party who cares deeply about the union between England and Scotland, that might motivate you to vote against this particular deal because you would see the impact on the Scottish desire for independence.
Can I ask you one other crystal ball, slightly longer, medium-term question, Charles, which is, it is said that one of the things David Frost, the Sherpa for the negotiator for Boris Johnson, who's going around the European capitals, he's saying he must have absolute clarity in the political declaration, the non-legally binding declaration that goes alongside the withdrawal agreement, that it is a Canada-style, dry as dust, free trade agreement, that Britain is going for nothing fancier or closer to EU institutions than that.
This is quite important, because it actually feeds through to the arguments about Ireland as well, because the deal that there will be, if there is a deal, is firstly a different withdrawal agreement with some sort of quasi-Northern Ireland backstop. Secondly, a different political declaration sketching out the future relationship, in which the sketch will be much drier, more positing a more distant relationship between the UK and the EU, as you said, so-called Canada dry. And what's more, the EU is insisting that Britain should, it says, stay aligned with the EU on social and environmental and consumer protection rules, perhaps on tax and state aid as well, so-called level playing field provisions. And the UK says, why the hell should we? If we're not close to you in the way that Switzerland or Norway are close to the EU single market, why should we align? And the EU says, well, you've jolly well got to align. You may not be Canada, but if you're not Canada, that's why you should align, because you're not Canada, you are a big strategic competitive threat on our border in the way that Canada is not. So although we did the Canada Free Trade Agreement without this level playing field alignment, if we do a free trade agreement with you, we will insist on the alignment. And if the British say unacceptable, we'll say to you, okay, it's going to be very, very thin and meagre free trade agreement, probably with tariffs included. There's a huge row going on about this. Now, this matters for Ireland and that debate, because if, as is likely, the political declaration says the future trading relationship will be a distant one, where the British are free to have different rules and regulations from the EU, to disalign, then that makes it much harder to solve the Irish border problem, because the more differences there are between the United Kingdom and the EU, the more issues there are to be dealt with through special alignment of Northern Ireland, which differentiates itself from the rest of the UK.
Well, that's why you need the backstop. And that's
exactly.
That's why you would have that within the withdrawal agreement.
Yes.
And also, in fact, of course, that was a very good argument for the sequencing that the Europeans insisted on, that they had to get agreement on the Northern Ireland issue before they moved into all these other areas, because of precisely what you're talking about.
It makes it harder to solve.
Do they believe that Britain really wants to go down that route? They hear so many different things from this confused country.
I think they genuinely do. They listen to right-wing Tory politicians talking about setting up a deregulated economy, slashing regulations on environment and social policy, rather like Hong Kong and Singapore have done. And they see this as a real competitive threat.
Michel Barnier keeps coming back to it, doesn't he? In all these statements.
I think it's genuine, because they listen to sort of the Thatcherite agenda that many Tory ministers speak to, the sort of Liz Truss, Sajid Javid view of the world. Now, the reality is, I would say, there's no way Britain as a country can actually adopt most of these rules and regulations. There wouldn't be a majority in Parliament for slashing these rules and regulations. I think the EU exaggerates the threat, but it's genuine, which is creating huge bad blood in the negotiation on the future relationship.
And might add to the difficulties of getting down on this landing strip.
It makes it harder to solve the Irish problem.
And I think also that, I think you're absolutely right, Charles, about the political climate here in Britain, that there is no appetite for that kind of deregulated future that some of these people are talking about. But nonetheless, in Europe and in some places here in London, if they look at Brexit, that's the only way it can work economically. The only economic advantage that Brexit brings is the prospect of deregulation. And so in that sense, the Europeans regard it as being a rational position.
Yes.
That's where it takes you to.
Yes.
They may be exaggerating how cool-headed people were when they put their X in that ballot.
Yeah, and we also forget that this is not the last British government there's ever going to be. It may not even be the last one we have this year. And so you could have very quickly, in a matter of weeks, you could have a British government which, whether the Brexit happens or not, is looking for a much closer and a very different relationship with the European Union than the current one is.
I'm not going to ask you the horrible question of what the next Parliament could look like, but I'm going to ask an equally horrible one, which is the percentage chance you'd put on the sort of deal we've been talking about this afternoon coming to fruition by October the 31st in order to be signed off then. We can do that one first.
I'd say 20 or 25% chance of the kind of deal we've talked about happening by the end of October.
Dennis?
I think it's a bit higher than that, let's say 30, 35, and actually maybe even higher than that again, simply because it's in the interests of everybody concerned, and particularly in the interests of Boris Johnson. Because the one big promise he has made is that he'll get out on time. And this is the surest way that he can get out of the European Union, more or less on time, is if he gets a deal done by then, October the 31st. And so I think it's hugely in his interest. I think the fact that things are changing a bit in Northern Ireland, I wouldn't underestimate the difficulties that Arlene Foster will have, and she'll have to get something to satisfy her concerns. But I do think that it is in everybody's interest to do it, and it's particularly in Boris Johnson's. And if he misses this opportunity, I'm not sure he's going to get another one.
You thought there was another scenario we could still be negotiating?
Yes, if there's not a deal by the 31st of October, and there's therefore an extension of Article 50 almost certainly going to happen, then there'll probably be a general election in, say, late November. If Boris Johnson wins that election, he would then go back, perhaps with a parliamentary majority, in a stronger position to negotiate the kind of deal and make the compromises that could be very difficult if he didn't have a big majority. So there could be a deal negotiated later on, before the extension ends on January the 31st.
It never ends. Thank you both very much indeed. 100% thanks. Very kind of you. Thank you.